The aroma of stale coffee and sizzling bacon hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort in the heart of Topeka, Kansas, on a crisp November morning in 1961. Silas Thorne, or rather Arthur Jenkins, as he now meticulously called himself, stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. His eyes, though scanning the morning headlines of the Topeka Daily Capital, seemed to see through the newsprint, fixated instead on an invisible horizon. He'd been a ghost for nearly 2 years, a phantom in the wind, building a new life brick by painstaking brick. The coffee cup, a thick diner mug, bore a small, almost imperceptible logo on its base: Harlem Gold. It was a detail Arthur Jenkins likely never noticed, a subtle, chilling whisper from a past he believed he had buried under 2,000 miles of highway and a mountain of federal paperwork. He had vanished with $75,000 in cash, a sum that in the early 60s could buy a man a new life or bury him. More than the money, he'd absconded with a trove of secrets, a meticulous ledger of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's operations, traded for federal protection and the promise of anonymity. He'd meticulously erased every trace of Silas Thorne, the trusted bookkeeper, the meticulous scribe who once held the keys to Bumpy Johnson's empire. The expectation, for anyone who understood the unforgiving calculus of the underworld, for anyone who knew the name Bumpy Johnson, was a swift, brutal, and utterly relentless manhunt. A blood debt that would follow him to the ends of the earth. But here, in this quiet diner, sipping coffee that carried a ghost of his old life, Arthur Jenkins was free. Or so he believed. This was the impossible outcome, the detail that never made it into the FBI reports. Bumpy Johnson never had to look for Arthur Jenkins. How could a man like Bumpy, the formidable godfather of Harlem, a legend whose name alone commanded respect and fear across the 5 boroughs, simply let a betrayer vanish? Was this an oversight, a sign of weakness, a lapse in judgment from a man infamous for his iron grip? Or was it something far more sinister, a calculated move in a game only he truly understood? Some shadows just follow you, even when you think you've outrun the sun. To truly grasp the chilling genius of what unfolded, to understand why the most dangerous man in Harlem never dispatched a single soul to retrieve his traitor, you first need to understand the world Bumpy Johnson built, and the man he truly was. Harlem in the early 1960s was more than just a neighborhood. It was a kingdom. A vibrant, roaring crucible of culture, ambition, and grinding realities. And at its heart sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, not as a king, but as a silent, unyielding force of nature. This wasn't the wild, untamed street violence of other crime syndicates. Bumpy operated with a distinct, almost philosophical precision. He was a strategist, a chess master, who saw 10 moves ahead, while his rivals were still figuring out the pawn's first step. His power wasn't just in the muscle he commanded, but in the intricate web of respect, fear, and even a twisted sense of justice he wove through every street, every club, every back alley. When Bumpy spoke, Harlem listened. When Bumpy moved, Harlem held its breath. His domain was vast, stretching from the numbers rackets to the bootleg liquor trade, from protection schemes to high-stakes gambling dens. It was a multi-million-dollar enterprise, built not just on intimidation, but on an unparalleled understanding of the city's pulse. A betrayal of Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a financial hit, it was an affront to a code, a challenge to his reputation, a crack in the very foundation of his empire. And Silas Thorne, his trusted bookkeeper, had struck at that foundation. Silas, a man of quiet numbers and meticulous ledgers, had seen the inner workings, the financial arteries of Bumpy's power. He knew where the money flowed, who paid whom, the hidden accounts, the secret investments. He was the scribe, archiving Bumpy's every financial move. But Silas had a weakness, a mounting gambling debt, a silent, gnawing fear that eventually drove him into the arms of the federal government. Agent Thomas Mallory, a driven-by-the-book FBI agent, saw Silas as his golden ticket, the key to finally bringing down the legendary Bumpy Johnson. Mallory promised Silas everything: protection, a new identity, a clean slate, and Silas, desperate and terrified, took the bait. He emptied a specific safe, one Bumpy rarely touched, making off with that $75,000, a sum carefully chosen to cripple a specific operation, not just to line his own pockets. Then he vanished, leaving behind a smoking crater of betrayal. The FBI, smug with their prize, believed they had pulled off a coup, clipping the wings of Harlem's most formidable figure. They settled Silas Thorne, now Arthur Jenkins, in a quiet, unassuming town, far from the concrete jungle of New York. They expected Bumpy's men to tear the city apart, to send assassins across state lines. They prepared for a war. But the war never came. The hunters never appeared. This silence, this profound lack of pursuit was the true enigma, a question that haunted Agent Mallory as much as it baffled the remaining players in Harlem. It defied every established rule of the game. It was as if Bumpy Johnson had simply forgotten. But Bumpy Johnson never forgot anything. The truth, as it turned out, was far more chilling than any manhunt. It was a strategic masterstroke, a psychological trap laid with such precision that Arthur Jenkins would eventually wish he had never left Harlem at all. The shadows that followed Arthur Jenkins even to the quiet, unassuming streets of Topeka, Kansas, were long and relentless. But they weren't cast by Bumpy Johnson's vengeance. They were cast by a past Jenkins himself believed he had meticulously incinerated, a past lived as Silas Thorne, the quiet, almost invisible bookkeeper for the godfather of Harlem. Silas was a man of ledgers and numbers, a meticulous organizer of Bumpy's sprawling, illicit empire, a silent cog in a machine of immense power. He knew the ebb and flow of every dollar, the hidden accounts, the delicate balance of fear and loyalty that held Bumpy's world together. His hands, usually stained with ink, now trembled with a different kind of calculation. For years, Silas had moved through Harlem's pulsating rhythm, a phantom among the flash and swagger. He saw everything, heard everything, and recorded it all without judgment. But beneath that veneer of professional detachment, Silas harbored a secret, a gnawing vulnerability that grew like a cancer, a crushing gambling debt. It wasn't the kind of debt Bumpy Johnson would tolerate from an outsider, let alone an insider. It was a silent countdown, a ticking clock that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed life, to snatch away the future he envisioned for his wife and two young children, a future far from the smoke-filled backrooms and violent undercurrents of Harlem. He craved a clean slate, a genuine escape, a life where the numbers he balanced were for a legitimate business, not for a criminal enterprise. This desperate desire, this yearning for a clean American dream, made him susceptible, a ripe fruit for the picking, and the man who came to pick him was Agent Thomas Mallory. Mallory was a rising star within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man molded by ambition and a rigid adherence to the letter of the law. He saw Bumpy Johnson not as a legend, but as a target, a puzzle to be solved, a kingpin whose intricate web could be systematically dismantled with the right thread. For Mallory, Bumpy's empire was just another criminal organization, susceptible to the same pressures, the same vulnerabilities. He believed Silas Thorne, the man who knew where every dollar was buried, was that golden key. Mallory didn't see Silas's decision to turn informant as an act of courage, but as a desperate gamble fueled by fear and self-preservation, a weakness he could exploit. The agent's confidence bordered on arrogance, convinced he had found the perfect leverage to finally bring down the untouchable Bumpy. The agreement was simple. Silas would provide everything he knew, every detail, every name, every ledger entry. In return, the FBI would grant him immunity, a new identity, and a fresh start in a place where the name Bumpy Johnson was just a whisper from a distant, forgotten world. Silas, now Arthur Jenkins, meticulously orchestrated his disappearance. He burned old documents, emptied safe deposit boxes, and practiced his new name in the mirror, watching the old Silas Thorne dissolve with each syllable. The flight to Topeka, Kansas, was nerve-wracking, every shadow a potential pursuer, every unfamiliar face a ghost from his past. But when he finally settled into his new anonymous life, the initial thrill of success, the rush of having truly vanished, was intoxicating. He had done it. He had beaten the system, and more importantly, he had escaped Bumpy Johnson. He was free. Back in Harlem, the streets buzzed with a different kind of energy. The word had spread like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson's trusted bookkeeper had vanished, turned federal informant. Rival gangs, street hustlers, even the beat cops braced themselves. Everyone expected a storm. They anticipated Bumpy's men fanning out across the country, a brutal, relentless manhunt, a chilling display of retribution that would serve as a stark warning to anyone who dared to betray the Godfather. The whispers turned into a roar of anticipation. They waited for the cars, the phone calls, the quiet disappearances that always followed such an egregious act of disloyalty. But the storm never broke. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and the expected brutal retaliation never materialized. Harlem held its breath, confused. Bumpy Johnson remained in his usual haunts, conducting his business with his characteristic calm, his eyes betraying no hint of anger or vengeance. The silence was deafening, a profound and unnerving quiet that settled over the city like a shroud. Why the inaction? Why the unnerving calm? This absence of the expected violent retribution was not a sign of weakness. It was a riddle, a core problem that gnawed at everyone who knew Bumpy's reputation. It created a palpable tension, a profound curiosity that hooked those who watched, forcing them to wonder if Bumpy Johnson wasn't playing a different game entirely, a game far deeper and more chilling than any simple manhunt. What could possibly explain such a calculated, unnerving silence? The chilling quiet that followed Silas Thorne's disappearance wasn't a vacuum, but a carefully calibrated pressure. It was the silence of a man who knew the game was far from over, a man who understood that some battles are won not with a roar, but with a whisper. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed godfather of Harlem, didn't chase after Silas. He didn't send enforcers to Topeka, Kansas, to drag Arthur Jenkins back to face a bloody reckoning. No, Bumpy Johnson operated on a different plane entirely, a strategic altitude few could ever comprehend. His reputation wasn't forged in street brawls alone, but in a delicate, almost invisible web of alliances, favors, and an uncanny, almost prophetic ability to predict the next 3 moves on the board. For Bumpy, the absence of vengeance wasn't indifference. It was a calculated, deliberate choice. He saw human nature as a complex machine, and Silas Thorne, despite his meticulous ledgers, was just another cog. Bumpy knew that fear, when properly nurtured, could be a far more potent weapon than any bullet. He understood that a man running from a ghost he believed was real would eventually break himself, and that in Bumpy's world was a punishment far more exquisite than a quick death. As the weeks bled into months, Arthur Jenkins, the former Silas Thorne, settled into a monotonous rhythm in Topeka. He managed the books for a small hardware store, his days filled with inventory and invoices, a stark contrast to the high-stakes arithmetic of Harlem's underworld. He believed he had vanished, a phantom erasing his own tracks. But the past, as Bumpy Johnson knew, was never truly gone. It simply waited. Then came the coffee. It started subtly, a flicker of recognition in the mundane. Arthur, a creature of habit, frequented the same diner every Tuesday morning at 7:15 a.m. for a cup of black coffee and the local newspaper. One crisp autumn morning, as the waitress poured his refill, he noticed the bag of beans behind the counter. Harlem Gold, a small independent brand known for its rich, dark roast, a staple in every diner, every stoop, every kitchen in Bumpy Johnson's domain. It was a taste, a smell, a memory he'd tried to bury under 2 states and a new name. What was it doing in a sleepy Kansas diner, 1,000 miles from its origin? He dismissed it. A coincidence, a small world. But the seed of unease had been planted. A few days later, a local newspaper, usually filled with Harvest Festival announcements and high school football scores, carried a small, almost hidden article. A brief mention of a zoning dispute in Harlem, New York, involving a property Bumpy Johnson had an interest in. Nothing major, nothing violent, but the details were too specific, too niche, to be random. It was a whisper from a world he had abandoned, a world that seemed to be reaching out, just barely touching his new reality. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't just seeing ghosts, he was seeing shadows where no shadows should exist. Agent Thomas Mallory, still tracking Silas from a distance, detected the shift. His informant, once so confident in his escape, now sounded frayed, his reports tinged with a growing paranoia. Mallory, ever the pragmatist, believed Silas was simply succumbing to the pressure of his new life, the weight of his guilt. But even Mallory felt a prickle of unease. He'd seen Bumpy's kind before, men who moved with a silent, terrifying grace. He just couldn't quite put his finger on what Bumpy's game was. Meanwhile, back in Harlem, the initial ripple of Silas Thorne's betrayal had long since settled. Bumpy Johnson had moved through his ranks with a quiet assurance, a look in his eyes that conveyed not anger, but profound understanding. He spoke in low tones, reminding his lieutenants that loyalty was earned, but betrayal was always seen. Whispers spread through the streets, carried on the breeze from the brownstones to the jazz clubs. Bumpy's always 3 moves ahead. It wasn't a boast. It was an article of faith. The organization, far from being weakened, seemed to coalesce, reassured by Bumpy's uncanny calm, convinced he had a plan no one else could see. Arthur Jenkins, however, was seeing too much. The Harlem Gold coffee started appearing everywhere, not just in his Tuesday diner, but in the gas station mini-mart on the highway, in the break room at the hardware store, even once in a specialty grocery store across town, sitting prominently on a shelf. Each sighting was a tiny, almost imperceptible prick. He began to scan faces in crowds, convinced he saw a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod from a stranger, a look that lingered a fraction too long, a subtle recognition in eyes that should have been unfamiliar. His sleep became a battlefield of nightmares, the faces of Harlem blurring with the bland expressions of Topeka. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, the bars invisible, yet undeniably present. The climax of Arthur's torment wasn't a shootout in a dark alley or a brutal interrogation. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year to the day since he'd fled Harlem. He sat in his usual diner booth, the aroma of Harlem Gold coffee filling the air, a scent that now tasted like ash. The local paper lay open, and there, circled in faint, almost invisible red ink, was a single innocuous advertisement for a small, independent coffee roaster in New York. Underneath it, written in the elegant, precise script he knew better than his own, was a single chilling phrase. "Some debts are never truly paid, Silas." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The blood drained from Arthur's face. He looked around the diner at the unsuspecting faces, the clatter of plates, the mundane hum of life. He realized, with a sickening lurch, that Bumpy Johnson had never had to look for him. Bumpy had simply let him run, allowing the weight of his own betrayal, amplified by these carefully placed psychological breadcrumbs, to become his true prison. The Harlem Gold wasn't just a coffee, it was Bumpy's signature, his silent, omnipresent reminder that no matter where Silas went, he would always be within Bumpy's reach, under Bumpy's gaze. He was a man who had erased his past, only to find his past had merely been waiting patiently to erase him. In that moment, Arthur Jenkins wished for the simple justice of a bullet. The psychological torment, the gnawing certainty that Bumpy had orchestrated his every move, was a far more profound and inescapable punishment. He was a prisoner of his own mind, haunted by a ghost that wasn't chasing him, but merely watching him from the shadows, enjoying the show. The dominoes fell swiftly, silently. Within minutes, Arthur Jenkins left the diner, never to return. He simply vanished again, this time not to escape Bumpy Johnson, but to escape himself, to escape the constant, crushing weight of Bumpy's unseen presence. Agent Mallory, receiving a final, cryptic message from his informant about the coffee, closed the file on Silas Thorne, a bitter taste in his mouth. He never truly understood the depths of Bumpy's game, but he understood one thing. Bumpy Johnson hadn't been defeated. He had merely proven once again that his power extended far beyond the streets of Harlem, into the very minds of those who dared to cross him. Within 72 hours, the whispers on the streets solidified into legend. Bumpy Johnson's reputation wasn't just restored, it was amplified, etched deeper into the very bedrock of the city. He didn't need to lift a finger, didn't need to spill a drop of blood. He had simply allowed a man to hang himself with the rope of his own conscience, proving that true power wasn't about what you did, but what you didn't have to do. The giant loop, the secret of Bumpy's unnerving silence, closed with a chilling finality. He knew. He always knew. The streets of Harlem taught a harsh lesson. Some men build empires with steel, but Bumpy Johnson built his with perception. He understood that loyalty isn't just a transaction, it's a sacred trust. And betrayal, no matter how far you run, always leaves a scent. The true measure of a man's power isn't in the enemies he crushes, but in the ones he allows to break themselves. Remember this: the most dangerous predator isn't the one you see coming. It's the one who already knows your next move. It's the one who lets you think you're escaping, only to find you're still dancing on his strings. That cold autumn morning in Topeka, when Arthur Jenkins finally saw the invisible ink, he understood the true meaning of Bumpy Johnson's silence. It was the sound of a man who had won long before the game even began. If this story of unseen power and chilling strategy caught your attention, hit that like button. Seriously, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to join the ranks of those who seek out the hidden truths, the stories the history books ignore. And tell me in the comments, was Silas Thorne's fate a just punishment for his betrayal, or was Bumpy Johnson's psychological game a step too far? Share this with someone who thinks they know everything about power. And next time, we're diving into a tale even more insane, a forgotten chapter where a single handshake changed the course of an entire city. Make sure your notifications are on, because you won't want to miss it.